It's one of the most intriguing mysteries in the lexicon of unexplained phenomena, and we're looking at it all wrong. What it is an experiment in how factual information can lead to the creation of a myth, and it is essential to understand the difference when investigating UFOs. Let's explore. Hi everyone, and welcome to Project Bluebook, where we explore all things unidentified. I am Thor, and thanks for tuning in. The facts about the Philadelphia experiment are as follows. In 1955, astronomer Morris K. Jessup published a book called The Case for the UFO, where he suggested they were worth investigating, including technological implications of anti-gravity and the use of electromagnetism technology to achieve it, loosely referencing Albert Einstein's unified field theory, that bending of light around an object to render it invisible, a science theory unrelated to anti-gravity propulsion. As a side note, the anti-gravity theory is claimed to have originated with Nikola Tesla and not Einstein. A year later, in 1956, Morris Jessup started receiving letters from a man named Carlos Miguel Allende, a pseudonym for Carl Allen, a real person and a merchant marine with the U.S. Navy, who among other assignments worked on SS Furuseth that is said to have docked near the USS Aldrich, subject of the Philadelphia experiment. In over 50 handwritten letters to Jessup, Carlos claimed to have witnessed, on October 23, 1943, the disappearance of the USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort assigned the number DE-173 while working aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth in the Navy harbor in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The ship disappeared, according to Allen, in front of his eyes, and then reappeared a few minutes later with devastating results for the crew members on board who were unaware of the experiment. Allende further claimed this experiment was conducted in collaboration with no other than Albert Einstein, who he claimed to have communicated with personally about the experiment, and it proved Einstein's unified field theory, the pursuit of bending light around objects, and by doing so making objects invisible, an experimental theory Einstein is known to have been working on around that time. In 1957, Carl Allen, under his own name, sent a book of Jessup's case for the UFO to the Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C., heavily annotated with notes in 3 different ink colors using 3 different character sets, as if written by 3 different people. The Office of Naval Research contacted the author, Morris Jessup, about the book, and he confirmed this was the same person's handwriting who called himself Carlos Allende and had been sending him letters for almost 2 years at the time. A year or so later, the annotated book, along with Allen's letters, was published by the Varro Corporation, a research company for the military, who received copies of the letter and the book from 2 ONR officers, lending further wings of truthfulness to the story, as if it had been leaked to Varro as whistle-blown truth from within the Office of Naval Research. And in some of the letters, Carlos Allende claims to have met Einstein, been trained by him, and asked questions regarding the experiment. Records show Carl Allen actually enlisted as working for the U.S. Navy at the time in the state of Pennsylvania. You see how the plot is thickening. After Jessup's passing by suicide in 1959, Allen became increasingly incoherent and unreliable, even as he continued granting interviews to the press, where he was prone to ramble on with claims of seeing soldiers disappear before his eyes in a bar, and later, in letters to relatives, he continued stating he knew crew members were lodged into the steel of the Eldridge as a result of the experiment, fused together with the ship's body, while others disappeared, never to be seen again, and yet others rematerialized inside out, with the sight of all of this driving surviving crew members mad, and it all explains his own incoherence and perceived madness as the years passed on. In other words, he could account for his own borderline insanity as resulting from what he witnessed, making his own account all the more believable. I am, of course, stating a point of view here, that I believe the Philadelphia experiment, as described by Carl Allen, aka Carlos Miguel Allende, did not take place the way he described it. But it did take place, however, in a different form, which has helped perpetuate the myth ever since. And it's a lesson in research and discovery. Let me explain. The USS Eldridge DE-173 began construction in Newark, New Jersey in February 1942. It was launched on June 25, 1943, and between 1944 until the end of World War II, it served as a destroyer escort on multiple successful trips across the Atlantic, alongside Navy supply ships carrying troops, equipment, and supplies to the European theater. It was decommissioned in 1946 and sold to the Greek Navy in 1951, where it became the Leon destroyer number 54 and served for decades, until it was sold to scrap metal in the 80s. The claimed event is supposed to have taken place on October 23, 1943, after the ship was built and before it began its missions across the Atlantic. It is an appropriate start to investigate the operational archives of the US Navy that do provide a pretty good indicator of the ship's whereabouts in the waning months of 1943. Here goes. It was commissioned on August 27, 1943, from the Federal Shipbuilding Dry Docks in Newark, New Jersey. From there, it sailed to New York's harbor, Long Island Sound, and remained there until September 16th, according to the logs. Then it sailed to Bermuda, where it arrived on September 18th to undergo training for crew in escorting ships, as well as training for submarine encounters and torpedo evasion. This continued until October 15th, when Eldridge left in a convoy back to New York, where it arrived on October 18th. We're getting closer to the 23rd. According to logbooks, the USS Eldridge remained in New York until November 1st, when it became part of a UGS-23 convoy that departed New York to arrive in Norfolk, Virginia on November 3rd. UGS-23, 23rd of October. Interesting coincidence. But on November 3rd, it sailed with the convoy to Casablanca, where it arrived on November 22nd. Thereafter, it left with convoy GUS-22 and arrived in New York on December 17th, where it remained until the 31st, when it returned to Norfolk to begin its European War Theater escort missions. According to this, it was never in Philadelphia. However, there are eyewitnesses within the U.S. Navy, including Edward Dungeon, a Navy sailor and crewman of the USS Engstrom, who spoke to UFO investigator Jacques Vallée for his 1994 published expose book on this subject. And Dungeon does claim the USS Eldridge docked alongside the Engstrom in Philadelphia before October 23rd, and the two crews fraternized together at the time. He also claimed the Eldridge left for New York at 11 p.m. the evening of the 23rd, on its way to Norfolk, Virginia, via the Chesapeake-Delaware Canal, a shortcut used by the Navy, making a 2-day trip accomplishable in less than 6 hours. That's what happened, according to Dungeon. And people seeing the Eldridge gone the evening of the 23rd and quickly appearing in Norfolk, Virginia a few hours later, that's all it was. Clearly, this contradicts the logbook, yet again giving credibility to the hypothesis of a teleportation and disappearance and reappearance of the ship. But something else was going on. A Philadelphia experiment it was, and it is possible the Navy kept the whereabouts of the ship off the books for a reason. In an effort to overcome the constant and frequently successful attacks by Nazi U-boats on cross-Atlantic convoys, the USS Eldridge was outfitted with large generators to conduct a top-secret experiment with a mission to win the Battle of the Atlantic by creating a technology that would render ships invisible to the enemy, not physically, but electromagnetically. This explains how the concept and stories have been conflated multiple times over and has supported the myth of the Philadelphia experiment and sustained its believability through the years. Because it's not completely false. It was about disappearing ships, but it had nothing to do with teleportation. The electromagnetic experiment was a method called degaussing, a process of sending a strong electric current through cables surrounding the ship. They called it coiling the ship to reduce its magnetic signature, to confuse and evade Nazi torpedoes launched with technology capable of pursuing magnetic signatures. Degaussing was this secret experiment, and it did involve electricity and magnetism, and it was spun into a story of electromagnetic anti-gravity experimentation and incorrectly conflated with Einstein's unified field theory aimed at bending light around an object to render it visually invisible. With facts and fiction fused together like so, a myth was created. It had nothing to do with Navy soldiers' bodies fusing together with the metal hull of the USS Eldridge. Albert Einstein coincidentally died on April 14, 1955, only days after Maurice Jessup's book was published, and 11 years after the Philadelphia experiment is said to have taken place, still unable to prove in concept his unified field theory. Carl died in 1994. The facts that have propelled this story include the undetectability experiment. Einstein was also working with the Navy at the time, confusing the matter even further. The USS Eldridge existed, Carl Allen existed, and both have evidence supporting them being in Philadelphia on October 23, 1943. The Office of Naval Research did receive the annotated book, and it did consult with Jessup on its authorship as a matter of due process, not as Allen would have it, to silence a man who knew too much. Allen was never silenced. With the unified field theory thrown in, and the era of the arrival of UFOs into the psyche of the 1950s, plus the Robertson Committee report being introduced the same year, a person with imagination and a flair for attention could spin a story around the facts that entered the lexicon of unexplained phenomena. The only connection to ufology is the annotated book. Otherwise, it has nothing to do with aliens or unidentified aerial phenomena. That we still debate its merit, that is the real Philadelphia experiment. You can watch and listen to this and other podcasts on Project Bluebook, the place for the exploration of all things unidentified. Each day, let's practice compassion and kindness. I say practice because there's always room for improvement in all of us. And please subscribe. I am Thor, and thanks for listening. See you next time.